Welcome to the monthly vinyl voyage. In September 2022, I started an experiment, building myself a new music collection from scratch at a rate of no more than one album a month. 2 years later, it's formed 24 great albums, and I'm taking a bit of time to look at each of the purchases, to learn more about it and to reflect on what it means to me, and to digress onto side notes that I find interesting. Thanks for taking the time to join me today. This month, my record of the month for March 2023, album number 2 in my collection, and it's Tracy Chapman, the debut album. This was released April the 5th, 1988 by Elektra Records, which by coincidence makes April 2023 the 35th anniversary of its release. Today I'm going to talk about this album, what it means to me, and also some of the amazing history. This is one of the first albums that I added to my collection, and I got this copy at the Ely Record Fair, which is a small event held in a town not far from where I live. Shortly after buying a turntable, I started to seek out and visit record fairs and start digging through the crates without a clue or a plan what I was doing. The temptation was there to buy loads of albums and also to buy the first copy of an album I would find. Now, I'm not big on peopling, but I was brave enough to chat with a lovely, patient seller at the Ely Record Fair who gave me some helpful pointers. He also knew that the copy of the album he was selling wasn't necessarily the only or best copy that was there that day, and he was kind enough to not just tell me that, but to explain why. Even though it cost him a sale, he sent me to his colleague's stall who had this copy, which was in slightly better condition and with the original liner notes. Why would he do that? Well, it was kind, but also he recognised that I was totally green and new to vinyl and to record fairs, and that a good experience would keep me coming back, and a bad experience might put me off this whole thing for life, removing the prospect of any future sales. One lesson I learned at that Ely Record Fair was that I needed to have a list of things that I was looking for. It didn't need to be definitive, just a starting point to stop me from being overwhelmed by the tens of thousands of albums in front of me. Now, I hadn't set out with a list, so I had to make one on the fly, and the first album that came to mind, my default, uncontrovertible choice, was Tracy Chapman. This is one of the few albums where I can tell you exactly where and when I heard it for the first time. I had a close friend throughout sixth form college and university. In fact, I was best man at his wedding. He was a guitarist and a music lover at an age where I wasn't so bothered. In term time, we were students with expensive tastes, so we used to get temp jobs over the summers. And because we were well educated and quite privileged, the jobs we tended to get would be office-based and were quite lucrative. But I remember meeting up with Greg at the end of one summer. He was staying back with his parents in their family home, which was a house that's in the village that I now live in fact. He was excited to show me a brand new Cambridge Audio CD player hooked up to some expensive Wharfdale floor-standing speakers. It turns out he had gotten a production line job at Cambridge Audio for 6 weeks that summer. They have a factory not far from here. I was a bit surprised because it wouldn't have paid very well compared to the office work that we would normally do. But it opened up a big employee discount for him on high-end audio gear. So he'd done the maths and worked out that rather than working somewhere else to earn the money to buy the system retail, it was cost effective to work there for 6 weeks for lower pay and buy the system at a discount. Now, this was a seriously expensive audio setup. I did notice that the CD drawer cover on his fancy system was a little bit crooked, and he sheepishly admitted that he'd actually assembled that particular unit and that defect was his fault. I mean, it made it very much his, I guess. Anyway, he wanted to impress me with the sound of this grand system, and to do that he played me this album on CD. And that was the first time I can remember hearing it. I don't have a good enough ear to tell you whether his system sounded as good as 6 Weeks' Wages ought to, but I immediately fell in love with her voice and this album. And once I'd discovered it, I played this album in my car constantly for years after. I had a handful of CDs in my car, and whenever I wasn't sure what I wanted to listen to, or if I was driving a group of other people around like climbers on a long journey, this would be my go-to default. Now, it's only 36 minutes long, so I would let it repeat endlessly, and I can't remember anyone ever complaining. I also remember driving my wife about in that little car and introducing her to this album at the same time. So let's talk about Tracy Chapman and this unlikely debut album. Tracy Chapman was born on March the 30th, 1964 in Cleveland, Ohio. Tracy and her older sister Anita were raised by their mother after her parents divorced in 1968. Her mother could only access low-paying jobs, and the family relied on welfare for support. But despite these hardships, Tracy's mother recognised her musical talent early and bought her a ukulele when she was just 3. Unfortunately, that ukulele was later stolen by a girl who lived across the street. As she grew up in Cleveland, Tracy experienced racial tensions and violence. The city had been forced to integrate the schools, so they were busing black children into white neighbourhoods and white children into black neighbourhoods. People were upset about that, and there were race riots. Despite the hostility, being bullied and repeatedly assaulted, Tracy has said that she always loved school and thought of it as her way out of Cleveland and her way out of poverty. As her school studies became her mission, music became her refuge, and she began playing guitar and writing protest songs in her early teens. Tracy's academic efforts paid off. At 16, she earned a scholarship to a prestigious boarding school in Connecticut, and at 18, she earned another scholarship to attend Tufts University. In interviews, she said that she always felt immensely grateful for those opportunities, acknowledging that they wouldn't have happened if it weren't for people who'd given something to make that possible for her. But while she was grateful for the opportunities, the transition to Worcester School was especially difficult for her. She felt the stark contrast between her working class background and the privileged students around her. She said, "I found that the people at school didn't really have that much interest. I was really angry about that, and that's where the song Talking About Revolution came from. Meaning that a lot of them thought that people who didn't have money or who were working class, their lives weren't very significant, and that somehow they couldn't make a change. But I feel that's where change comes from. That's where people are most in need." Tracy played at chapel services and performed at coffee houses using a borrowed guitar, and recognising her dedication, the school chaplain, Reverend Robert Tate, organised a collection to buy her a new guitar. These early experiences of hardship and resilience shaped Tracy Chapman's music and the themes of social justice in her songwriting.
Hi, my name's Tracy Chapman, and I'm a local folk musician. I've been playing in the Boston acoustic music scene for the past 4 years now.
Chapman was discovered in 1987 by a fellow Tufts University student, Brian Koppelman. And Koppelman went to see Chapman perform at a coffee house called Cappuccino. He said, "Tracy walked on stage and it was like an epiphany. Her presence, her voice, her songs, her sincerity, it all came across." Now, Koppelman approached Chapman after the performance and said, "I don't normally do this, but I think my father could help you a lot. And that's because Charles Copperman, his father, was the co-owner of SBK Publishing, one of the largest independent song publishers in the world. Chapman listened politely, but didn't say much and went on her way. She was only 23 years old at this point. Undaunted, Copperman continued to attend her shows, sitting in the front row, and Chapman finally agreed to talk, but she declined to cut any demos for him. Copperman found out that Tracy had already recorded some demos at the Tufts University radio station, WMFO. Copperman went to the station, and while a friend distracted the DJ, he lifted one of the tapes. He made a copy and took it to his father, and his father immediately flew up to see them, and the album was recorded later that year. This debut album would eventually be produced by David Cushionbaum. He said, "This album was made for all the right reasons. There were a set of ideas that we wanted to communicate, and we felt that if we were truthful and loyal to those ideas, then people would pick up on the emotion and the lyrical content that was there." This was such a brave mission statement, given the musical climate in 1988, and certainly not the direction that this album was first headed. Having signed with Elektra, Chapman was set to record with legendary producer Alex Sadkin, who unfortunately died in a car accident right before recording began. Thrown into crisis, the record company called in someone far less experienced to take over. So Chapman and 4 session musicians and the new producer set up to record near Woodstock in New York State. Tracy said, "He put me in the middle of the room. They were all around me. Everybody was playing wildly because he gave them very little direction. And the music was horrible, horrific." So I called the production company after a few days saying, "This doesn't sound good." And they were like, "We think it's all right, just stick it out." After a few more days, it still wasn't working. They insisted again that I continue, so I just said, "I'm leaving." I mean, let's just recognise how hugely brave that was for a 23-year-old with no experience in the industry. SBK turned to several other producers, who all turned down the project before they found David Cushionbaum. He said, "I've been looking for something acoustic to do for some time." There was a sense in the industry of a slight boredom with everything that was out there, and that people might be willing to listen again to lyrics and to someone who made statements. Wary from her previous attempt, Chapman's greatest concern during the meetings with Cushionbaum was that the integrity of her songs remain intact. She said right off the bat that she wanted the record to be real simple, said Cushionbaum. "I wanted to make sure that she was front and centre, vocally and thematically, and that everything was built around her." There was a great interview with her drummer from this and other albums, Denny Fogheiser, and he was one of many who auditioned. Now, it's rare to have auditions for a record. Usually musicians are just hired. In 1987, Denny's career in recording was just starting. He had a tour booked with a band in Europe, but he got a call from the producer's office, and they said they were going to send him a cassette. They were looking to do a record and wanted to hold auditions and put together the right unit for Tracy Chapman. So they sent Denny a cassette, which was just Tracy playing and singing. And he loved the songs and her voice. When Denny went down for the auditions, there were different bass players and drummers going in, and he could hear some of what they were playing through the door. Many of them were playing more poppy style, which was popular on the radio then, but then he heard Tracy's voice and guitar differently. He felt her voice was everything, and the drums should support that, not cover it. So he did his thing, probably some brushes and a side stick reggae groove, and then left. When Denny got home, there was already a message on his answering machine asking him to come back the next day. He went back and they told him they wanted him to do the record, but they hadn't landed a bass player yet. They'd played with a bunch of people over the next day or two, but Denny suggested Larry Klein, known for his work with Joni Mitchell. David contacted him and Larry loved the cassette. He came down and they played for about 20 minutes and it just clicked. Denny says that the live tracking they did for this album, with himself, Tracy and Larry playing together, was critical for its success. It was more than just about getting a good take. It was about capturing a feeling. It wasn't necessarily about perfection, but about the emotion, this magical thing that you can't really pinpoint and you can't replicate every time. He says, you can play perfectly every time, but you can't always capture this magic. So recording was fun now. The live experience with the three of them, guitars and vocals, bass and drums. Some parts were overdubbed or punched in later, but the core of the take had to be solid to build on that magic. Mountain of Things was the hardest track to cut. Tracy was so used to just singing and playing that when she encountered a slight rhythm change that the band might add, it was somewhat disorienting for her. Kirschenbaum recalls, we had Paulina da Costa in one day and we tried it with just him and Tracy, and that ended up being the version we used, with the other instruments added later. Similarly, Behind the Wall was recorded a cappella and then left as is. Danny also reflects that he thought Tracy was amazing and he hoped people would hear this album, but he wasn't sure the radio would play it because it was so stripped back and unlike anything that they were playing on the radio, which was dominated by machine-made pop. Despite its unconventional approach, the album was both a critical and commercial success. It won several awards, including 3 Grammys, and sold millions of copies. Composed of 11 tracks, the album was praised by most critics almost immediately upon release, as a return to simplicity and the purest folk traditions. The stark realism of Chapman's songwriting, combined with her warm, richly textured vocals, brought refreshing integrity to the airwaves. Many of the songs on the album address serious social and political issues, such as poverty, domestic violence and racial injustice. Tracks like Talking About Revolution and Behind the Wall brought attention to these topics in a way that was uncommon in mainstream pop. Chapman's songwriting was deeply personal and introspective, with a focus on storytelling. Songs like Fast Car told vivid, relatable stories that resonated with listeners on a personal level. The narrative style was different from the more superficial themes often found in pop music. Chapman's music gave a voice to marginalised groups and addressed issues of race, gender and class. Her success demonstrated that there was a significant audience for music that tackled these important topics. When I think of the social history of this period, I tend to think of the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. I remember it as a period of very rapid social change, which was widely reported on TV, with people literally knocking down the wall with sledgehammers. The social change and ending of apartheid in South Africa happened shortly after, in the early 1990s. It was arguably a bigger social change, but it happened more gradually, with fewer iconic moments that I can remember, except perhaps the release of Nelson Mandela. On the 11th of June 1988, South Africa was still divided, and Nelson Mandela was serving his 26th year in jail for his anti-apartheid beliefs and activism. A concert was held in London's Wembley Stadium as a tribute for Nelson Mandela's 70th birthday. It was broadcast live to more than 600 million people in 67 countries, and its planners aimed to raise the international profile and respectability of the ANC and to increase the pressure on the apartheid government to release Mandela, although officially, and under the terms of its broadcast licence, the concert had to be politically neutral. A host of music icons were invited to perform in London, including Sting, George Michael, the Eurythmics, the Bee Gees, Wet Wet Wet, Whitney Houston, Peter Gabriel, Simply Minds, UB40 and Dire Straits, all taking the stage. But before them, at 3:05 in the afternoon, Tracy Chapman walked out alone onto the side stage at Wembley Stadium and performed 3 songs: Why?, Behind the Wall and Talking About Revolution. Admittedly, it was a warm-up slot, But let's imagine Tracy Chapman standing backstage at Wembley Stadium, feeling the weight of the moment. Just a few months before, she was performing in small coffee houses, intimate settings where she could see every face in the audience. Now, she was about to step out onto a stage in front of 100,000 people. And she had nothing to hide behind, just her songs and her guitar on the small side stage. She says her hands were shaking, but she delivered a flawless performance. Her voice was steady and her guitar playing was precise. Stevie Wonder was scheduled to perform a headline slot, despite not being officially announced, so the Superstition star arrived in London earlier that morning. Heading straight to Wembley Stadium after his plane landed, his band were already rehearsing for his set, which was due to take place after UB40s. But disaster struck, with Stevie refusing to come on stage, leaving the organisers in a panic. The hard disk for his synclavier synthesizer was missing, and clearly affected by the fear of his performance not being up to scratch, he ran back down the ramp in tears with his band following. An empty stage and a live broadcast left the organisers scratching their heads about what to do. And so Tracy Chapman agreed to perform again, and it blew everyone away. Partly it was the simplicity of her act that made her perfect to fill the gap. It just needed her and her guitar as she ran through backstage with a guitar lead writhing and dragging along the floor behind her. Tracy emotionally delivered Fast Car and Across the Lines to a mesmerised Wembley Stadium audience. By the time she'd finished, the slow build that had accompanied the release of her debut album had turned into a torrent. With an estimated global audience of 600 million watching the concert through their televisions, these two songs made Tracy Chapman a world star. From a respectable 250,000 copies sold before the show, Tracy Chapman sold 2 million records in the month that followed. Stevie Wonder did in fact perform later on in the evening, after agreeing to forgo his equipment and just shout the key changes to his band through the microphone. Less than 2 years later, in April 1990, Chapman returned to Wembley to play a charity concert for Nelson Mandela, an international tribute for free South Africa. And Nelson Mandela was there, having been released from prison 2 months earlier. Now come on, that is an epic story. I have a legit 1988 issue with the original liner notes, which, as I said, I picked up at Ely Record Fair. I like to think that this is one of those 2 million copies that somebody bought after seeing Tracy at Wembley, but it's impossible to know really. I would, however, buy a 35th anniversary reissue if it were remastered today, and I'm keeping my eyes peeled to see if that happens, but there's no news yet. This album won the Grammy Award for Best Contemporary Folk Album and the SKC Boston Music Award for Best Rock Album of 1988. The single Fast Car won Best Female Pop Vocal Performance at the Grammy Awards, and the single Talking About Revolution won Top Song 1988 SKC Boston Music Awards. Tracy Chapman won the annual Grammy Award for Best New Artist. So what's to love on this album? Well, simply everything. This album is superb from beginning to end. There's not a single weak track, which I think is in part because Tracy had spent years working on these songs before they were recorded. There's not even a track which is aged badly, which speaks volumes about the production decisions that were made. Behind the Wall was recorded a cappella and left without instrumentation, which I can't think of any modern artist who would do that. And I didn't like it originally. I mean, I didn't skip it, but I considered it an interlude before the sweet Baby Can I Hold You Tonight came on. But I think I've come to appreciate the brilliance needed to pull off that track. I mean, it wasn't released as a single, and due to its a cappella nature and the heavy subject matter of domestic violence, it didn't get much radio airplay. However, the song is highly regarded for its powerful message and is a standout track on this album. I like to think that if it had been a single, it would have been competing with Faith by George Michael, Got My Mind Set on You by George Harrison, Never Gonna Give You Up by Rick Astley, Sweet Child of Mine by Guns N' Roses, Heaven is a Place on Earth by Belinda Carlisle, and Don't Worry, Be Happy by Bobby McFerrin. This was a stonking time for music, with a particular sound, and it wouldn't have made sense to chuck something as deep and heavy as Behind the Wall into the ring to compete for airplay with that list of giants. Fast Car, however, can and did compete on that list of singles. So what's missing? Nothing. This is literally a perfect album. On later albums, Tracy tried other things and experimented more, and for me, none of them are as good as this. In 2024, Tracy Chapman's Fast Car experienced a remarkable resurgence in popularity, thanks to a duet performed with Luke Combs at the Grammy Awards. If you've not watched it on YouTube, just go and watch it. It is superb. This collaboration brought renewed attention to the song, propelling it to the top of the iTunes charts. Chapman's original recording of Fast Car became the #1 song and music video on iTunes, and her debut album reached the #1 spot again. Again, her Grammy Awards performance highlights the timeless appeal of Fast Car and this album, and how it can be introduced to a new generation of listeners. Luke Combs' cover of Fast Car won the Country Music Association Award for Song of the Year in 2023. This win made Tracy Chapman the first black woman to receive a Country Music Association award, underscoring the enduring impact of her songwriting. So if I could add anything to this album, it would probably be a bonus track of her collaboration with Luke Combs. Well, that was album number 2 in my collection from March 2023, Tracy Chapman's debut album. I'm sure I've made mistakes in my research and my presentation. I'm only human after all. But thank you for listening.